וגם אני פתאום רואה את הקולות.
And welcome back to another episode of Kolot. This is your host, Rabbi Hillel Kappenstein, director of the Columbus Community Kollel, and it's a great honor and privilege to welcome all of you back to our next episode featuring Steve Rosedale. It's always a privilege when we get to show how diverse the group of guests are, and we've thankfully had Rabbanim, mental health professionals, sports figures, and now we get to have a businessman come on and talk about his journey and how they carry from life Torah values into the workforce. So I think you'll very much enjoy this conversation as well. To sponsor a Kolot episode, email me, sponsorkolot@gmail.com. Again, that is sponsorkolot@gmail.com. But without any further ado, allow me to tell you about our guest. Steve Rosedale was a combat soldier in Vietnam and following his service in the war founded Communicare Health Services in 1984, a large Midwest healthcare company. Steve is also a founding board member of Nachal Haredi, member of Eretz HaKodesh, member of Board of Governors of Jewish Agency, and founder of the Cincinnati Community Kollel. Steve, thank you so much for joining Kolot.
My pleasure.
So can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your upbringing?
Well, I'm Cincinnati born and bred, all 80 years. And I began to Baal Tshuva when I was 45 years old. And how I got there was perhaps a longer story than your show will permit, but I'll give you some of the highlights.
Please.
In my last year of college at University of Cincinnati, I literally bumped into a young lady who turned out to be from Israel. I was instantly smitten. And in our first conversation, she said, well, you know, this summer I'm going to Israel. And like that, I said, me too. Where is it? Middle East, you say? Turned out, yeah, I bought this ticket and she decided not to go. And I had this ticket. What am I going to do with it? But something was pulling me forward. So I decided to go. And I remember flying from Basel, Switzerland. It was midnight. I was on a student charter flight. And I'm looking out at the stars. And the students in the front of the plane are starting to sing these songs. And all of a sudden, tears are coming down my cheeks. And I'm thinking to myself, what in the world is going on? And in the early morning at sunrise, we landed in Israel, the old Ben Gurion Airport. This is 1965. And I found myself getting out onto the tarmac and I bent down and I kissed the ground. And I'm thinking to myself, what in the world am I feeling? Why am I doing these things? Well, I ended up on a kibbutz, not a religious kibbutz, and spent a month and a half there, going through the old pond, picking apples, having quite an adventure. And all the while, I'm imbibing this Jewish experience that I never had before. I mean, in the past, it was like I grew up. I knew we were Jewish. Everybody was Jewish in my neighborhood. All of our friends and relatives were all Jewish, but the religious aspect was not something that stuck with any of us, frankly. And the Israel experience that I was having was awakening me to something that I had no clue that existed, that I was part of a Jewish people. I was part of a Jewish people that had a land, that had a heritage, that had a religion, that had such a wealth of value that I was just totally ignorant of. And the last day, as I'm heading back to the United States after 4.5 months, someone grabbed me, spun me around. I'm in the Taka Merkazit in Yerushalayim. the old train station. He poked me in the chest with his big finger, and he said in English, he said, I'm looking at this tall, crusted, black, capote, flaming red beard. And he said, your mothers teach you Greek and Latin. What do you know of your own heritage? And I'm backing up, what kind of crazy person is it? But it stuck in me like an arrow. I couldn't get it out. And for 20 years, it centered around and it affected many, many of the decisions that I made. And after that, I decided to join the Army, volunteer for Vietnam. He's a Meshuggah. Why did I do such a thing? But you have to understand, when you don't come from a traditional background, when you don't have wise people to guide you, who are your mentors? The philosophers, the writers. So Plato said that a young man has to go to the gymnasia and he has to serve his country. It's part of molding him into be the kind of person that he needs to be. And one of my favorite writers, Ernest Hemingway, was ambulance driver in the First World War, and I said, that's exactly what I want to do. I'll go into the medical service corps. Little did I know that the Army had their own ideas. And at a certain point, they said, son, here's your gun, and you're going there, right? And I ended up as a combat soldier, and it certainly changed my life. And I remember we were all green troops. We came over so scared. We had no clue as to what was going on. Back in the United States, it was running up and down the hills, shooting blanks, less like cowboys in India. But this was real. And here you could lose your life. And I remember drawing a big Jewish star on my helmet, and I said, if anybody's up there, keep your eye on this one. Well, it changed my life. When you're pressed up against your own mortality, and every breath that you take could be your last, and every second you feel the beating of your heart, it makes you aware of life as a precious commodity that so different than you had before. And when I came back, I was a different person. Of course, I had a lot of questions that I had to answer. And I went around looking for those answers. Why did I survive and my friends perished? Actually, I spent 6 months in the hospital before I was discharged. By the time I was wounded, 90% of my group was casualty. It was a tough place. But I couldn't find the answers in the philosophers and the writers. And I remember I got married, I had children, and I said to myself, I still don't understand why I fell in love with this Israel. Why did that open me up the way it did? I want my children to have a Jewish education. Just like the Chassid had said to me, you know nothing of your own heritage. I wanted my children to learn. Now, the religion was a different story, but so I sent my kids to this day school. And as my oldest son graduated from the 8th grade, the principal, a very special person, Mr. Janowski, said to me, well, you have to send him to yeshiva. And I said, that's enough. Out of town, listen, I wanted a little heritage, I wanted a little Jewish education, but enough is enough, right? He pestered me for 3 weeks. And finally he said so sincerely, for the sake of your child, you wouldn't look. You wouldn't see it. What could I do? For the sake of my child, I had to go look. So I went to this place in Baltimore near Israel. And, oh my goodness, another life-changing experience. I remember the young men who came up to our car and they were going to escort us to the administration building. They looked so clean cut, the dark pants and the white shirts. And I saw young mothers on Yeshiva Lane carrying their babies with their hair covered, and they looked so wholesome. And then I met the Rabbi Herman Neuberger Shalom, and he had such an impact on me that I said to my son, of course he was called Jacob at the time, he's Yaakov now, but I said, Jacob, if you're not going here, I am, because something is going on here. They've got goodness here. I don't know what it is, but you got to get some of it. So he ended up going to Ner Yisrael. And it wasn't but a few years later that I decided to put a kippah on my head. 35 years later, here I am.
Wow. Quite some journey. That's incredible. I want to just go back to your days in fighting in the Vietnam War and leaving combat. What's that like mentally? I know some people talk about suffering from PTSD and the transition from combat to regular life. How was that journey for you, specifically leaving the Army?
Well, you have to appreciate the trauma that people go through. First of all, even if they're not injured, just the fear factor alone. Now, you tamp down that fear, else you couldn't exist, but it's always in the back. And then when you see people killed, and you see dead bodies, when you see the suffering that goes on, let alone in my case, it was what we would call now an IED explosion. What happened was that we had overrun a bunker complex. So the lieutenant and I are down in the bunker, and I'm reading this letter from a girlfriend to her now dead boyfriend, because he had caught me at the letter, and literally a tear-stained letter. And all of a sudden we heard an explosion outside and ran out, and guys writhing on the ground. And a bunch of people were starting to move around, and a friend of mine, sergeant, said, freeze, we're in a minefield. And then an idiot next to me, who turned out he was drunk on rice wine, picks up this beer can that was attached to a fishing line, and the world blew up, right? It took out 8 of us, and the pain was so intense, it felt like I was holding on to, 220 volt wires, and literally I had this out of body experience where I saw myself sort of keel over from 15 or 20 feet away, and everybody else was moaning, and I remember thinking to myself, well, that's reasonable. And I heard myself moaning, and literally a very weird experience. Because then they gave me some morphine, and I sort of jumped back together again. But you go through trauma like this, and it doesn't leave you. It just doesn't leave you. So when I was discharged, I had a very difficult time. Even though I was 6 months in a hospital, still, I had a very difficult time adjusting. I remember my sister was talking to a friend, and they were laughing, and I ran over and started yelling. I said, do you know that I have friends dying over there? How can you be laughing?
Right.
And I'd say in the beginning, it was with me every minute of the day. But you can't function like that. So it sort of fades a little bit. And as you start to get on with life, it begins to recede into the background. But it was literally decades before I could say that every day I wasn't thinking of it.
Wow. People they just don't appreciate what it's like on the other side and what the sacrifice is like, and not just during the time of service, but post-service as well.
It's one of the reasons why I felt an arthritis, a responsibility for soldiers in Israel. And that as I once told our Rabbanim, I said, do you know what it's like to have the Malach HaMavet's breathing down your neck? You know, you're walking on point and you don't know what's going to be 3 or 4 feet in front of you, and you don't know if the next second you're going to be alive or dead. So, you know, what these young men go through is traumatic at the very best, and that's if they retain their life.
Right, right. Oh my gosh. Ooh, so we're actually, that might be on my list of questions down as we get there. But in the next segment, I want to talk about your profession, Communicare Health. So before we get into the company, can you tell us what was your first ever job?
My first job was teaching for my father. My father had a dancing school in Cincinnati. He also had a television show, and before that, a radio show. So all the Rosedales had to learn how to dance. And I started when I was 10 years old. But perhaps my most interesting job was when I was 16 years old. I was going to Walnut Hills High School, and I took a class in psychology. And I found it so interesting that summer I got a job in a Longview State Mental Hospital. It was a state-run facility, 3,600 patients. Best I could say, it was like a snake pit. I was on the receiving ward, old men, young boys, no medications, crazy, bizarre behavior. My training was a 3-day orientation where what I remember was don't get bitten. And I remember after a week, they brought in this guy who was a huge monster-looking fellow. He was handcuffed in front with these leather handcuffs and deep-set eyes. He would stalk the floor. Whenever he was, I was on the other side of the building. You know, wherever he was, I'm maneuvering, right? But after a week, they said, you have to shave, Randy. They gave me a razor. They didn't even give me shaving cream. I'm shaking and I'm following after him. After 20 minutes, he sat down in a chair and I sort of cornered him. And he said, Fred, I got to shave you. I started to rasp on with this dry razor, and he grabbed my wrist, and I'm thinking, that's it, you know. But he just gently helped me shave him. And when we were done, he said, thank you. And all of a sudden, the monster fell away. And I saw a human being. And it literally changed my life. What I understood in a very short time is that the biggest difference between me and these people is that I got to go with that. And that we're all coping with that. Sometimes we cope positively and constructively, and sometimes we cope negatively and destructively.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, I heard about the dancing. I was told about that. Do you still dance?
Well, in the mood, it's me.
That's good. Okay, so let's talk about Communicare Health. How did that come about?
Well, part of my literally repatriation to humanity after the military was that I went to Brandeis graduate school for sociology, and I literally needed to put myself together, and I needed to find answers to some of the deep questions. One of the things I learned was I studied with a professor named Mari Schwartz, a very gentle, kind, and wise person. In fact, I wrote a book about it, Tuesdays with Mari. And I learned from him the concept that he developed called a therapeutic milieu, developed in mental hospitals. He said, you know, if you treat people like human beings, they'll respond as human beings. Because what happens in hospitals, nursing homes, prisons, any institution, is that the institution forces institutional behavior on both its inmates and the people that work there. And it does so for efficiency's sake. You know, you can't afford to have people acting out, and for the cost, you need to feed people what you need to feed them instead of the other. And people lose their sense of responsibility. They become the child to their children. So this concept was interesting at the time. I didn't know how it would affect me. But later, when I got into the nursing home business, which was sort of by accident, that a lot of things in my life sort of happened by accident. No, I've learned since that I think it was the Ramona Shalom maneuvering thing. But it came to be an important part of our philosophy of care.
Wow. So, and today, fast forward a couple decades, I suppose, how many people work at CommuniCare?
Well, probably more than 16,000.
16,000. Okay, so let's talk about that. How do you communicate your message to 16,000 employees?
Boy, is that a good question. These days, there's so many different electronic mediums that we communicate in many different ways. But frankly, it's like the oral tradition. You have to pass it on from one person to the next. And in part, it has to do with how you treat other people. You know, your children learn from what you do more than from what you say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same way with people in an organization. How you treat them will have a very large effect on how they respect you or not, how they understand what you stand for. And we make a very large emphasis on values. Our values, which we encapsulate in an acronym HEART, starting health, H for honesty. And I tell people, you know, it's my name that you're trashing. And when I say honest, I mean, be honest with yourselves. And then perhaps you can be honest with others and have the courage to be honest and tell the truth. Because we'll stand behind you. Honest mistakes are mistakes. But you got to be honest. And E is for excellence. Because if people aren't striving for excellence, then they don't appreciate that the job that they're doing is important. And A is for accountability. We all have to be responsible and understand that we have to have the courage to look at our own work and hold ourselves accountable. And R is for respect. I have to tell you, most people want respect, but they don't appreciate the fact that you got to give it before you're going to get it. And the T is for teamwork, because individual superstars are important, but it's the team in the end that really gets the job done.
So we got honesty, excellence, accountability, respect, and teamwork.
Yeah.
That's the heart of CommuniCare Health. I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
And as someone who founded this and who's been running this, can you share beyond this, maybe a leadership lesson or two that sticks out in your mind?
My understanding of how to manage people and circumstances changed dramatically after I started learning Torah. For example, I always believed that I told my staff that we have one job, and that's to reach out with our hearts to touch other people's hearts. But it wasn't until I started learning that I understood that that's exactly what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants us to do. In fact, when he's choosing a king for Israel, and Shmuel Navi goes down to the house of Yishai and got 7 handsome sons, and he takes the biggest and the best, and the Rebbeinu Shalom said, no, not this one, and he said this one. Gets down to the last one out of the field. You know, nobody would thought enough to even bring him in from the field from the sheep to have an interview with the Navi. And Shmuel says, no, Rebbeinu Shalom, what do you want? He says, and the Rebbeinu Shalom says to him, but Hashem doesn't look on the outer appearance. He looks upon the heart. And I found that it's our professional skills are critically important, but what really heals is the heart. And if you reach out with your heart to touch another person's heart, amazing things happen. And if you have time, I'll tell you a really extraordinary story.
Please.
So I got a call from old Dr. Reed. Says, Rosedale, I've got 2 patients. You're going to lose money. But for me, you're going to take it. He was a sort of gruff character, still made house calls, but he had very strong feelings for his patients. So, and he said, they're not going to live so long, so you won't lose too much. And into our facility came Reverend Harris, preacher at a little Baptist church, and his soulmate, the leader of the choir, Tommy Harris. And Reverend Harris was in the final phases of Alzheimer's disease. So at the time, we called it senile dementia. And Tommy had terminal spinal cancer and was confined to a wheelchair and paralyzed from the waist down. But she was a beautiful woman. She just had this sense and presence about her that she emanated love. And she brought her organ into her little chapel, and she was singing these spirituals and would swear the Malachim would come down to listen. Just a beautiful song. Well, I put her on a wing of a nurse that was very special. She was an old Marine nurse. Well, I thought she was old. She was probably in her 50s at the time. Little did I know, the 50 is a spring chicken these days. Looking back. But in any event, so she and Javi became fast friends. But Irene came up to me one day and just started crying. Mr. Rosedale, I don't know what to do. She said, Tommy is so blue. She said, Irene, I'll never see my daffodils bloom in the spring. And this was in February. And I remember the day. The next day was February the 13th, and it was this sleety rain. And the sky was dark. And before her shift began at 6:30 in the morning, she planted these plastic daffodils in front of Tommy's window. And for Tommy, the sun shone that morning, and she saw her plastic daffodil. She rolled into my office in her wheelchair and said, Mr. Rosedale, the Lord's not ready for you. I said, God bless you, Tommy. You stay with us forever. You're family. Well, sure enough, the spring came, and she actually saw her daffodils bloom. And we're having a fundraiser for the Heart Association called a Rock and Roll is a Wheelchair Marathon. And we were having wheelchair races. People were betting on it, and we were giving the money to the Heart Association. So I'm calling the play-by-play live on the radio with this telephone book out. So I'm calling, they're coming around the nurse's station, Santa Andy's in the lead. And Tommy rolled up to me and said, Mr. Rosedale, I'm going to touch my toes. I said, Tommy, I'm thinking paralyzing and touch your toes. Let's talk about this later, okay? And like all strong women, she ignored me and just sat there. In a couple more minutes, she said, Mr. Rosedale, I am going to touch my toes. Now the staff are all gathering because I was starting to make noise. And I said, would you please take Tommy to a day room? We'll talk later. I'm on the radio. But she just sat there. And then another minute later, she said, Mr. Rosedale, she looked at me in the eyes and started to get up from that wheelchair. We started to yell and scream. She bent over and she touched her toes. And that summer, she walked out of the facility with a walker and lived for 3 years in an assisted living facility. When she was ready, she came back to us to pass away. Wow. And I called the staff together and I said, when you can be part of the vehicle for Hashem's miracles, it's not a job. It's a mission.
It's a mission, right?
And it's been that way ever since.
Wow. What a story. Wow. Okay, one last question. I love the positive take that you had on your mission, but also could come in your line of work is a lot of stress and a lot of turmoil, especially the last couple of years. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of what it was like during the pandemic with so much going on. I know it's a loaded topic, but maybe a little bit, if you could share with us in a snapshot some of the challenges and how you guys survived.
Well, frankly, when you set out to do good things, the rebellious level will test you.
Right.
I remember we started the Kolot, and this was like in 1999, 2000, something around there, and a few years earlier. And by 2000, my business was going down the tubes to the point where functionally I was probably bankrupt. I had taken on a huge responsibility, had little clue as to what I was doing, and it was really going down the tubes. And I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to make payroll with COLA, you know? And as my son swears to this day, my son Ronnie, he says, you know, the reason we've done so well is because we never missed a payroll. We, supported it no matter what. So that was my challenge. And of course, we rebuilt ourselves back and had good fortune. So I turned the business over to my two sons. My son Ronnie Wilhelm does the nursing homes and many ancillary businesses. My son Yitzchak has the behavioral business and drug rehab. So they're the ones who were on the front line of the most difficult times in the last few years. And I told them, I said, guys, you're doing wonderful things and you get tested. Ronnie was the president now in the Kolot, and Yitzchak started in the SIP in the girls' high school, and he's done all his things. And so when you set yourself up to do these good things, the Rebbeinu Shalom said, well, you really, really, really emistica here, it's like learning recently and the Dart. And I think it was Rav Yochanan said, I'm not sure of the attribution, but says, I never will eat from a carbon of a Nazir, except for one case. Now, why wasn't he eat from a Nazir? A carbon from a Nazir? Because he didn't believe it. It was really for purely anesthetic reasons. He said that there was one case. A young man came to me and he said, I'll tell you my story. And, I was looking one day at a little pond and I saw my reflection for the first time. And I saw that I was handsome and good looking. And I fell in love with my reflection. And I said to myself, can I be drawn into this world that has purely for the purpose of nourishkeit and taken away from the world of Torah by looking at my reflection? So I became a Nazir. And the Yochanan said, from you, I'll eat from your carbon. And it's hard to do things lishma, purely for the sake of heaven. And the Rebbeinu Shalom will test us. And Baruch Hashem, my kids have stood the test, and it's all working.
Wow. That was in my list of questions, and I guess you beat me to it. I do remember you mentioning in a different context about how your business grew as much as your involvement in the community grew. And to see how it, not just with yourself, but also in the next generation is a testament to how Hashem gives people the tools and the tests that are specifically made for them. As we wind down, I do want to ask, it comes a certain amount of a lot of things that come only with experience. And as next generation of leaders come, I want to know if you could share some of your advice and on both ends, young people entering the workforce and also young people entering askanas, community work. What is your advice to them?
Well, if you're entering into business for the money, and choose another profession. If you're successful, it's because Ribono Shalom will put it into your hand. If you're not doing some type of work that's going to benefit other people, and I don't care whether it's making something and, running a business. We're in a business where you can do mitzvahs every day. And it's not so simple because people are in very sick circumstances. But no matter what business that you're in, if it's not benefiting people, and if you're not providing a good, then it's just money. And frankly, you have one mana, you want two manas. And it's a vicious circle. And it's not a healthy lifestyle. And don't do it. If you look at business as an opportunity to do mitzvahs, and you could do that not only in the service or the product that you're providing, but how you treat and take care of people. Your dealings with other people are always an opportunity to live a Torah-like life. And to the degree that you are reimbursed by the Ribono Shalom, use those profits for what the Ribono Shalom wants us to do. For chesed, for building community, for doing all the good things. If you do that, you'll be successful.
Wonderful. Yeah. Enter for the right reason and good things will come. Wow. Well, Steve, this was a real privilege for us. Only less than 100 miles away or so. You hear so many things about someone, and to finally sit down and chat and hear it, I was going to say in person, but in Zoom was really a chus for us, and we're very thankful for your wise remarks and your journey. Not every day you get to speak to someone with the journey from Vietnam, sending their kids to yeshiva on their own spiritual journey, and running the company and embedding the values that you do. So thank you so much for joining Kolot. It's an honor and privilege to have you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the good work you do.
Thank you.
To listen to all Kolot episodes and see upcoming guests, visit kolotpodcast.com. We are also on all podcast players. Type in Kolot on iTunes, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Podbean, and Amazon. Share with your friends, and please make sure to give us a 5-star review. Kolot is a project of the Columbus Community Kollel, a full-time Jewish learning center in Bexley, staffed with high-caliber Torah scholars. Ever since 1995, boys, girls, men, and women from all backgrounds and affiliations have found many opportunities to connect with Torah and mitzvos at the Kollel. Whether it's a study partner, an engaging lesson, or a program, the Kollel is your one-stop shop for all your Jewish learning. If you want to know how you can benefit from the Kollel, visit thekollel.org. That is TheKollel.org, and forever be inspired.